All right, good morning. My name is Destiny Eldridge, and I am here with Lee Belleville, and we welcome you to our December Iowa Core Advocates webinar. We're excited that all of you are here, and we want to go ahead and get started promptly at 9 o'clock because we have a lot to cover. Just some webinar logistics for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. We ask that you use the chat feature to ask questions and make comments. We will keep everyone muted throughout the webinar just to ensure that we don't have a lot of background noise. However, if you would like to speak, you can unmute yourself, but then just be certain that you do mute yourself again, or I'll be watching and I can always do it as well. And then secondly, the webinar is recorded and will be archived on a public site. So just want to put out that disclaimer as well. We're going to go back and we will revisit the resources that we've been looking at for analyzing text complexity. And then secondly, we do have a guest speaker that we'll introduce momentarily, but we're going to discuss what it means to be college and career ready, and the challenges that students currently face post-secondary as they're entering those fields. And then the last item is to provide support to employ questions and tasks that are text-specific and reflect the standards. So we're going to start moving more into now that we understand text complexity, how do we use it to our advantage and support students with it? Okay, so a quick review from our November webinar. We have been focusing primarily on complexity. And if you remember, these are our three shifts: complexity, evidence, and knowledge. And we always go back to this because this is really driving a lot of our webinars and our work. Rather than focusing exclusively on literacy skills, college and career ready standards, including the Iowa Core, set expectations for the complexity of text that students need to be able to read. Thus far, we've practiced analyzing the quantitative and qualitative measures of text complexity, as well as reader and task considerations for the purpose of planning and scaffolding instruction. And so that's kind of where we are today. And Lee is going to go ahead and take over and revisit the enrichment task that we invited participants to do prior to today's session.
Okay, so I am going to share my screen as soon as Destiny passes that over. Okay, our enrichment task, November 7th, was actually in relation to supporting all learners with complex text. And during that previous webinar, as part of that enrichment task, we shared several resources with you to explore further, including that aligned blog on achievethecore.org, which is also linked, and a webinar to view before today's webinar. So the first article was supporting all learners with complex text, strategies to scaffold instruction of standards-aligned complex text, and it shared 4 strategies to assist students. So those strategies are supporting vocabulary, using deliberate annotation, using questions as planned scaffolds, and then also allowing time for reflection and discussion. Then what we asked is that for further exploration, you could take a look at the webinar, Supporting All Learners in Accessing Complex Text, and that was the 2007 February webinar. And then we asked that you were to respond to 4 reflection questions that were posted to our November 7th, 2017 Padlet. So I'm going to go ahead and show you where this webinar is. I know that there's several of you for certain who were able to take a look at this, and you also provided us with feedback. If there's a few of you who have not had that opportunity, then you can still do so. And we're going to leave the Padlet up as well so that you can continue to build upon other people's ideas. But this is where you're going to access that particular webinar. And then this is the Padlet. So I'm going to show you how to access that as well. And these are all of the responses that we've received so far. So you can take some time later to kind of read through each person's response. I have synthesized those and kind of pulled together some of the overall takeaways from the members who have completed that particular task. So I wanted to share those with you. We have practicing with complex text in its academic language increases confidence and stamina, which is essential due to texts that they will encounter in college and career, which I feel definitely connects to what we're going to end up covering with our content today. Teachers need assistance in learning how to evaluate text for complexity as a process to determine scaffolding. And members would like to share the PDF with others and point out the importance of allowing time for students to read text uninterrupted. So if there's a few of you who have not done this particular activity, I kind of just wanted you to take a look at the actual PDF that I have linked within the Padlet. So you can always take a look at that as well. And it actually lists quite a few different strategies that you could do before reading, during initial reading, during subsequent readings, after and between readings, and then other suggestions. So we're not going to read through those today, but I did want to make you aware that those are there. And that is what this particular bullet point and what that particular member was referring to. The last one is providing background to students that is accessible before the complex text and do not assign complex text as homework. So those were some questions that were answered by our members so far. And what I want to do next is take a look at the optional activity, because we were sharing a lot of information with you during that last webinar. But this one in particular was an optional additional activity. What makes this text complex? So we were asked on this particular piece that members could utilize one of the following guides. So this was actually in Microsoft Word, and it was meant to support analysis of a text for complexity. And here is the Read Aloud for Grades K2 that I can show you. And if you click on Resources and scroll down, this is where you will find those original files. So I wanted to bring that to your attention as well. And then what we had is actually a member last week, Carrie Johnson, and she's also one of our Iowa Core advocates, and she's a literacy consultant at Heartland AEA. She did complete this optional activity and shared her experience via Twitter. She did regret that she's not going to be able to attend this particular webinar live, but she's going to watch the recording. And so I asked and received her permission to share out a copy of her work with all of you as a sample. So what I want to do is show you the sample, and I actually transfer this over to a Google Doc. And I put those other Word documents into a Google Doc as well, because I felt that it might be easier for all of us to share out these resources and complete it electronically, because then you can just make a copy of it and store it in your Google Drive. So this is an actual sample that Carrie went through, and she was utilizing this form. And the first step that she would have done is she was taking the text that she was actually analyzing. It was called Mango, Abuela, and Me. And her first step would have been to go to lexile.com. So I'm just going to show you quickly that first step that she went through. And what you're going to need to do is scroll to Find Books using Find a Books. So I'm going to scroll down, and here's the link, Find Books using Find a Book. And all of you can explore this website further if you haven't been on here before. And then the quick book search is actually in the upper right-hand corner. So she would have typed in the title of the work, which I've already done here, so you can take a look, and then search for that. So after doing so, we find that the English version here is at AD 560, and the Spanish version is listed as AD 790L for Lexile. So Carrie actually recorded both of those levels on the form. So I'll show you here, AD 560 and 790. And I'm going to go back and explain here for just a moment. For those unfamiliar with the AD, this means that it's adult directed, and the book is often read aloud to students first prior to the independent reading. And this website actually provides an explanation of this for you. But picture books can appear to be easier to read when in actuality, it could pose a challenge for students to navigate the text independently. There may be times when a Lexile level is not available for a text with this particular website. So you could access other tools for quantitative analysis. And what I did is I updated that previous Word doc, and so I wanted to show you here in the sample. If you take a look here with this link, the previous link you might have noticed that was on the Word doc that was issued by Student Achievement Partners was no longer valid. So I went ahead and linked this particular piece that I thought would be beneficial to others, especially if you're sharing this resource out. So this is an updated link. And this one in particular takes you to the page for text complexity. And then if you scroll down, we have these other quantitative tools that are available for you. So I thought that this would be helpful, so then that way there's an active link on this Google Doc. So then that would have been her first step. And then she would have considered the 4 dimensions of qualitative features for the text. And she did note her ideas in relation to meaning and purpose, structure, knowledge demands, and language. And then last, Carrie recorded her thoughts regarding reader and task consideration. So you can take some time to go through this sample. Her reader and task considerations were just thinking about those questions about what would challenge my students most in this text and what supports can I provide. So she had listed some of her thoughts there. Determining implicit themes may present some challenge to students. The Spanish vocabulary is not explicitly tied to context or phrase sentence lines. And then she also was taking a look at this second question. How will this text help my students build knowledge about the world? So these were some of her thoughts in relation to this particular text, that it could help bring understanding of Hispanic, Latino culture, and the universal language of love. It can also support growth mindset in themes such as overcoming barriers and initiative in finding a way to solve a problem. Helping students consider connections they have and others they long for can improve relationship building. So again, this sample is here for you to take a look at, and you could explore that further. But I thought that that might be helpful for those who have not completed this activity yet, and you could take a look at what she did, and then you could try it out yourself. So this is a blank master copy that I linked for the grades K2, and that is a Google Doc version. And then this is also a blank master copy of grades 2 through 12, and that is also going to be a Google Doc. So as Carrie reflected about the process of utilizing the guide to support analysis of a text for complexity, she did share her thoughts with me, and I wanted to share those with you because she could not be present today. Considering text complexity really helps determine if the text meets your purpose. For example, if you're using the text for close reading, it helps shape the lesson and determine if the text is rigorous enough for multiple reads. If using for a read aloud to develop vocabulary or theme, it helps in the same way. Mining a text this closely helps you consider areas where you may need to do the heavy lifting, areas where you can plan scaffolds to shift that to students, and areas of the text where they can be independent or successful with class and peer discussion. A very basic consideration of lexile level can help you keep track of the levels of rigor based on grade level you're exposing students to. And what a gift as a teacher and planner to read and reread a text and thoughtfully consider the richness and power of an author-illustrator. The 4 categories of qualitative features can support teacher planning in a way we've not had before. And I think, too, can help build the reader-writer connection, as the focus for writing can be shaped through understanding what writers do when they communicate their messages. So thank you to Carrie for sharing that, and also sharing her thoughts on Twitter as well. So you can all take a look at that. And again, we continue to encourage other members to share their thoughts and their work that they're doing as well. So we are going to be transitioning into our guest speaker, Brandon Abdon, and his content is going to certainly relate to what we've covered so far. So circling back to that webinar that you watched for enrichment, Student Achievement Partners shares that students' ability to work with complex text is the most important factor in college and career readiness and reading. So challenges can arise for teachers when students struggle to engage with complex texts in their classes. So based on feedback received from our members in September, they would like to hear more about college and career readiness, which we have shared with Brandon already. Questions were posed by several advocates, such as, what does it mean to be college and career ready? How do we define college and career readiness? What are the expectations for students and the challenges our graduates are facing at the college level, or even in terms of entrance exams? So we did invite Brandon Abdon of College Board, who is volunteering his time today to share his insights with us. Welcome, Brandon. Thank you for joining us today. We would like to begin by asking you to share your thoughts regarding a question posed by our advocates. What does it mean to be college and career ready? Specifically, what skill or ability differentiates college and career ready readers from other students?
Yeah, well, before I get into the question, let me ask the most important question myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, just to make sure. So again, before I get into the question, thank you for asking me to do this. And this is an excellent opportunity to get to talk to people who know what it's like in the classroom and get to work across classrooms, which is a really excellent opportunity for us. So thank you. So the answer to this, as far as I'm concerned, isn't any kind of magic bullet, and is going to seem probably so reductionist that people won't believe it. But I've been doing so much recently with literacy and with comprehension. The big separating factor is the ability and willingness to engage a text multiple times, regardless of the difficulty of the text. And it really gets to something that you kind of mentioned in what you were speaking about earlier, some of the work you all have already done, some of the discussions you've already had about students' fluency with any text and their willingness to engage multiple complexities of texts and their willingness to re-engage a text. So here's my example. So just to be clear, I am not the director of English for all of College Board. There is no such person. We have English directors and executive directors at different points along the way in College Board. For example, on the SAT side, which I know nothing about SAT. The only thing I know about SAT is how to spell it, and that's it. There is an executive director in charge of a guy named Jim, with whom I'm friendly and good colleagues. And they manage the work that goes on with the multiple choice parts of the SAT. I'm also good friends with the SAT essay team. And then there are other groups on my side, the advanced placement side of College Board, that work with pre-AP or Springboard. Some people may be familiar with that. I work specifically with and am in charge of the English program and advanced placement. So I am very uniquely positioned to care a lot about what happens with I'm going to say a high school junior or senior, though I know some AP English courses are taught at freshman, sophomore level. Most of them are juniors or seniors, so I'm just going to talk about that. I'm very interested in the relationship between high school juniors and seniors and the transition into college and what they learn about reading, not what they learn about texts, what they learn about reading. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. The transfer that we want out of the English courses isn't necessarily knowledge of a particular work of literature or knowledge of a particular rhetorician. The transfer we really look for is the ability to engage a text, comprehend first, comprehend what is actually black and white literally happening in the text first, and then move into interpretation if we're talking about literature, or what's the next big idea here if we're talking about nonfiction texts. And so you probably heard my emphasis there. If I was typing it, I would have italicized it and put underline and probably bold-faced it as well. The point about comprehension. Because too many of my teachers, and I often call the AP teachers my teachers, too many of my teachers read it and jump straight to interpretation, or read it and jump straight to purpose, not making certain that the students in the classroom actually understand what's being said black and white in the text. And so the thing that we are really pushing here is that teachers spend time with students in the literal, in the black and white, so that students can build that foundation of understanding first, and then move into the more complicated literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, development of argument, etc. So in a very small nutshell, I would say what skill or ability differentiates college and career-ready readers from other students. College and career-ready readers understand that they're not necessarily going to understand it every time the first time. and they're willing to go back, re-engage it, and really find out what's being said there. Black and white, literally. The non-college ready reader is the student who has been taught in some way, and never intentionally, but who has been taught in some way that I read it, I don't get it, I can't get it, I'm dumb, I'm not going to try it again. And so I'll stop right there and see where, Lee, you would like to go with maybe a follow-up question, or if anybody else has any other questions. I see Destiny pops up there. Maybe she has a question. I'll turn it over to y'all.
Sure. So let's see if, let's provide a moment if anyone who's on the webinar has a question at this point or a comment. Okay. So I think that the maybe the next question that I would pose is as it regards to some barriers, perhaps, for students in the classroom. You kind of, address the teacher role and so on, but maybe a discussion about the artificial barriers versus the real barriers, and then how that relates to ability and willingness, which you also touched upon.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to clarify for me, Destiny, because I think there might be a term here that I'm not familiar with that has been part of the discussion to this point. Sure. So give me an example of what you mean by artificial barriers versus real barriers.
Sure. So I think for the artificial, thinking about those instructional shifts that teachers need to be able to implement, but then the real barrier might be with students being able to actually having the ability to move forward.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying. So might I recast that? And if this is if this demonstrates a misunderstanding, again, correct me. But it seems to be the line between things that teachers can control and things that teachers can't. Okay, good. Thank you for that. You're going to get students in any class, not just an AP class, who, for whatever reason, cannot read the text in front of them. My wife is an occupational therapist in the school systems, and so we have lots of conversations about students' abilities to do things, and where those things are environmental, where those things are actually biological. And so I'm not going to split hairs between those, but you're going to get those students who come in your classroom and you have to engage them in different ways. I mean, that's the reality of some students being able to do it. So when we say every student is able to do that, I don't necessarily believe that. I think every student should have the opportunity to do something and challenge themselves and learn something from it. But I don't think that any kind of disability should prevent a student from having the opportunity to try something. And I know that I'm treading on some very thin special education therapist ice here. And so we can talk about that too if you want a little later. But it's the artificial that really about which I really concern myself the most, to your question. And the biggest thing for me, and what I push teachers in the AP literature course and AP language course, again, the caveat being here that we don't tell teachers how to teach their course, but part of my job is also to plan outreach and presentations and professional development materials that help guide best practices. And so one of the things that we are learning through work with teachers who are moving the needle on students who are typically struggling readers and struggling populations, through other research that we've done through some of the Marzano and the Hattie methods and things of that sort, is that teachers just simply need to slow down and take their time with texts. When I see a syllabus where a teacher is teaching 9 college-level texts in a year, I'm very concerned, because that seems to me to be more of a course that is about texts than it is about literature. And what I mean by that is they are teaching texts, teaching facts about texts, teaching what is happening in the text. And more often than not, it turns into a lot of class discussion, which is really a euphemism often for lecture. And what we have learned is those teachers who are teaching populations that typically struggle, whether it be populations based upon socioeconomics, whether it be populations based upon race, gender, class, what have you. We've learned that the teachers who are making the biggest strides with those populations, not just in AP classes, but in English classes, period, as far as teaching students to read and comprehend and then transfer those things to other reading, are teaching fewer texts, but not necessarily teaching the texts more in depth. They're taking time to teach specific reading skills and thinking skills with those texts. Because there's something there's two things here that I use when I talk about these things. And I don't know if I coined these, if I heard them somewhere or what. If I haven't heard them somewhere, then consider this a copyright on them. But I will call them the comprehension bumps and the literacy leaps. And so teachers often run into the comprehension bumps because they will ask interpretive questions about a text. And the students are sitting in the classroom saying, well, yeah, I read it, but I don't get it. And then the literacy leap is the same kind of thing, where teachers will throw a book at a kid and say, hey, go read this, now tell me what it means. And again, they're running up against those comprehension speed bumps that are slowing them down. And so when you teach fewer texts, comprehension doesn't slow you down as much along the way. The number one strategy for this sort of thing, as far as an instructional shift, might be what I call a touchstone text. That is not mine. I read that somewhere. A touchstone text, the idea that you read one short, fairly accessible text multiple times throughout the year, and every time you introduce a new skill or introduce a new approach or a new way of thinking about text, come back to that text that you've already read. And students will say, oh, we've already read this. You know, oh, we've read this 5 times already. Well, can we read something else? Yeah, but the point is they've read it, they know what's happening in it, so that you don't have to get over those comprehension bumps and you can start teaching something. So when I taught literature, AP literature, my text was The Story of an Hour. Now I get it, that's pretty canonical if there is a canon. That's pretty, dead white person, yeah, but it was a book, it was a text that was short, had a lot to it, and was accessible, and I was teaching plenty of things that I would say are, quote, non-canonical outside of that. But my students probably read that 15 times a year. Anytime I would introduce a new character construct or introduce a new structure of text, because there's so much there. A text that I would shift year to year with my nonfiction texts, but I really had a lot of success with Letter from a Birmingham Jail, parts of it, not necessarily the entire thing. But I would switch from year to year. You find a text that is shorter and a little bit more accessible. Or an excerpt that is shorter and a little bit more accessible. That way you don't have to get over those comprehension bumps. I think that matters. But this isn't to say that you just read that one text all year long. Let me reiterate. You read that text, you keep coming back to it, but then you're reading other texts in there too, and you're building on complexity and things like that.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. I would also ask, I have in my notes that maybe you could touch on another instructional decision about sequencing particular texts throughout the year.
Yeah, it's really funny that you just asked that, because what crossed my mind when I started talking about teaching other text was, well, you can't just teach any random text.
Right.
But I wanted to see where you were going to go with it. So, Destiny, one might think we had planned this, but really, to everyone out there, we didn't necessarily plan that question to follow up. You can't give May texts in August is really the nutshell statement for that. If you think about an AP course, and again, people talk about, quote, AP strategies. I don't really know what that is. I think it's good teaching, good pedagogy. I think AP meets a lot of success in places because we provide and support training for teachers, and we support that training, and we have a lot more supports that are going to be coming out of the next couple of years because we've seen success with that. So I don't want to say that this is an AP strategy. This is a pedagogy strategy, a planning and pacing strategy. I spent 8 years in teacher education at the University of Kentucky, and this was the thing that teachers often get back with me about. now, and that's the idea of thinking you're not going to ask them to do something in August that you would ask them to do in May. And I think a lot of AP people who come into teaching AP new, but not just neophytes, people who've been teaching AP a long time, may come into August and say, okay, it's August, these are AP students, they're taking a college class, I'm going to give them hard times, like the book, Hard Times, or I'm going to give them Wuthering Heights, or over the summer they're going to have to read Crime and Punishment. Well, listen, y'all, I didn't read Crime and Punishment until I was like 300 or 400 level junior, senior in college, and it was no fun then. And I've gone back and read it as an adult, and I appreciate it. I really do. I get it. I like it, but I don't love it. It's not the kind of thing that I would recommend to people as a read. You know, it's an important read. I didn't read Dickens at all until I was later in college. And so we really need to think about what we're doing with texts and what we're doing to students. You're probably not going to make students want to engage in reading if those are the texts that you're assigning all of the time. Now, I understand people say, well, but it's a literature class, the AP course is, if we're going to talk just about AP. And they need to have certain texts for the exam and so on. That's true. But you need to scaffold that. Based upon your population of students, what their abilities are, what they're getting before they come to you, you need to really think hard about the books that you give them in August or September, whenever school starts for y'all. And how those build to other books. Now, not just literature, we're thinking nonfiction. You need to think about the length and complexity of text that you're giving students in August or September and how that builds into larger, more complex, more complicated arguments later on. So Letter from a Birmingham Jail is really not very, the argument's not very complex, but the text is complicated. So qualitatively, the text is more difficult than it is quantitatively. If you were to kind of look at those two measures using, I don't know, Lexile, and then maybe an ACT, or what we're going to be releasing in about a year or two, our own qualitative descriptions of texts. And you're not going to throw a Cartesian argument at them, or probably not something written, probably not a piece of fiction that tries to function as an argument at them in August or September. That's really, really important to think about as you teach skills and as you scaffold towards those things. And really, this isn't part of the question, but I think it becomes part of the answer when we talk to teachers about these sorts of things. I get lots of teachers who say, yeah, but I want to know what they're able to do. I want to test and see what they're willing to do. Well, that really comes across to me as gatekeeping. And we have to be very careful with that. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. I get that. And we have to think about that and think, yeah, that's my intention, but what are my consequences for my students? Because those students see Crime and Punishment in the summer and they think, okay, I'm not taking AP. Or if it's not AP and they're being asked to read, I don't know, Homegoing by Yagyasi over the summer, and they're in a school where they've never been engaged to a text like this. You think, oh, it's a pretty easy read. Yeah, but each chapter is a different vignette, and if they've not been exposed to that sort of thing, it can get really confusing if they're used to it being one long plot-driven story. And so you really need to think about all of those things. This is the kind of text that would need to be taught in a classroom so that I can frame it and teach it. For summer reading, I'm giving like Sue Grafton or James Patterson, or something that they're going to read and enjoy, because, I mean, that's what I enjoy reading. You know, I enjoyed reading this book, but I'm not necessarily going to go enjoy reading Hard Times ever. And so think about those sorts of things too.
I think that's an excellent point, Brandon, because I know oftentimes it's not really necessarily the student's ability to access the text, but sometimes it can be their willingness. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I'm wondering, and a question that I would pose to you too is, kind of to even to tie this up too, or unless we have other members who have questions, is what would be your advice to everyone who's going to be listening to this webinar about building self-efficacy? And in your experience, what have you found to be successful to build students' confidence?
So when you say self-efficacy, you're talking of the students as readers themselves, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, just to make certain. We in some of these discussions, we start throwing around vague pronouns, and we don't know if we're talking about teachers or students or what. So just to be clear, so thank you for that, Lee. Yeah, so the word grit just came to mind right before you asked me that, and that's such a buzzword, and I can't stand buzzwords. Buzzwords make about as much sense to me as mission statements. There's a point to that where you say, yeah, I want students, students are going to read James Patterson. They're going to read Sue Grafton, those pop novels. That's great. But when they really have to engage something that they don't want to engage, they need that grit to get through it. And I agree with that. And I think that kind of goes to what your question there was, Lee, about how we build that efficacy in students as readers while also helping them enjoy what they do. And sometimes my answer to that is just be honest with them. Say sometimes we have to read things that we don't necessarily want to read. But also think about approaching the importance of the subject matter in the text. I love the idea, and I know this is old school for a lot of people, but anticipatory sets or anticipation guides or whatever you want to call them. Anticipatory set is what Madeline Hunter called it when she was doing her writing about pedagogy in the 90s. It's still very pertinent today. Dewey was doing the same thing in the 20s. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just the way you want to approach it. But introducing things thematically and then giving the students the very difficult text. And students saying, well, this is tough. Why do we have to get it? Say, well, it's a complex issue. You all see. There's not just a black or white answer here. And so that's why this text is so complex. There's also the point about teaching what I will call a pre-20th century text, but I'm not going to say that it necessarily has to be complex. But people often associate pre-20th century text with more complex text. That's not necessarily fair, but that's what I'm going to say. Students say, why do we have to read all this old stuff? Well, old people had good ideas too. And we've got to find a way to engage those ideas. And that becomes an issue of fluency. How can I look at what I do understand in the text? Sorry, I'm pointing at the screen here. How can I look at what I do understand in the text to build meaning about what's happening there? And then here's the real grit part. Why do I need to go back to what I didn't understand in the text to try to understand it, and how does it change the argument? You're not going to get that on a single read. I can't even read the first 10 amendments to the Constitution without having to reread parts of it because it was written so long ago. There's been so much said about the comma in the Second Amendment or the clause in the Fourth Amendment about search and seizure and things like that. And you really have to pay close attention to those things. And teaching one of those amendments and having to go back and look at it again might be a good way to say you got to read and reread. And this is why. What do you understand? Now, you can't just ignore what you didn't understand because that matters. You've got to go back and look at that too. So it kind of goes back to the original question of what skill or ability. It's both the willingness and the ability to read a text, get parts of it, and not be afraid to go back and re-engage with parts that I didn't get. I feel like I may have diverged a little bit from your question, Lee. I want to make sure that I covered what you were looking for.
I think so. And I know that I have experienced in the past in college, and you brought up some of your own personal experiences too with complex text. And I think that your point is valid in terms of helping students to understand that there are going to be certain texts that are going to be difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think many college students today, even my own son, is now in college, and they are having to grapple with text that is much more difficult and at a higher level than what they were exposed to in high school. So it can certainly be more challenging. I know that Destiny's been monitoring the chat, so she could maybe add if there's any extra questions from others, or if somebody has a question now and just wants to unmute and ask a question, then we could certainly have time for that as well.
So Lee, at this point, there haven't been any questions in the chat, but we will open it up to folks if they have any questions or comments. Okay, so here we do have one.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I thought I was going to get to tell my wife I talked for an entire hour and nobody asked me any questions.
We have a question. Okay, so Michelle says all true, but how do we get kids to actually do that, to be willing to go back to the text? And you can definitely address this, and we will also be continuing on in this webinar to address this question as well. So if you have something you'd like to offer, Brandon, please.
I think it goes back to your question, Destiny, earlier about artificial impediments. My word, not yours. I can't remember the word you used, but artificial problems. And the idea that showing students the value of slowing down with the text. Read the text. It might be so simple as reading a paragraph from a text. Again, I'll say letter from a Birmingham jail. And highlighting in green the things that you do understand. And then out to the side, maybe you do it as a double entry journal. Maybe you do it as a simple guided annotation. This is the thing. Guided annotation is much better than free form annotation any day, because guided annotation has a purpose and you know what that purpose is, versus just, hey, go home tonight and annotate this and bring it back. The Hattie research says that that is not as valuable as guided stuff, but that's a plug. Sorry. Highlighting in green what you understand, going off to the corner or in your double entry journal and summarizing what you understand, and then highlighting in red some of the problematic problems, or underlining in red some of the problematic statements, things you don't understand, and then looking up the words, talking to friends, trying to hash it out to figure out what it says, summarizing those parts, and then synthesizing the two summarized parts. What do these things mean in relation to one another? How does my initial summary change with the new things that I now understand? And then drawing inferences based upon that. It's very slow. It's very tedious. But I'll tell you, it means you'll teach fewer texts, you'll teach more skills, and you'll build more confidence in students. Because the message we send now to students in many cases, and I'm generalizing, we have to be careful when we generalize, I know. But the message we send now to many students is, you read it. If you didn't get it, you're dumb. And so teaching students that it's okay to struggle with the text. It's okay to have to stop and slow down and do things like this is fine. I still, when I'm reading articles, I still like to read things on paper. I have the iPad and I'll read on it, but even when I'm reading on my iPad, I'll use the highlight function because there'll be words I don't understand or turns of phrases I don't get, and I'll highlight them or circle them if I'm reading on paper and go back at some point and look something up. Or pull out the world in my pocket and Google it to find out what that word means. And maybe modeling that for students ourselves. The other thing there is what I'm just now talking about, showing students how it matters in the real world. I was not a math person. We've probably asked, why do I need to know algebra in every day? And I would get well, you're going to have to figure out problems and everything else. Well, my math teacher was really telling me that I need to be able to engage complex thinking and methodological thinking is what they were trying to get across to me. And that's what we need to do too, is model the fact that we need to be engaged readers. What differentiates a smart reader from a not so smart reader is the ability to engage and then re-engage to build a better understanding. So I could go into many different ways to do it, but I think the big broad thing here is slow down and plan slow lessons with texts that show students it's okay to struggle with a text and how to overcome some of those struggles.
Awesome. Well, you've created a beautiful bridge for me.
Oh, that's what I do.
You didn't even know. So this, really will guide us into the next portion of the webinar, which is, how do we slow down and create those really intentional lesson plans and instructional moves? And some of the items, a couple of things that we're going to discuss is this idea of close reading and close analytic reading. But again, beginning with understanding the black and white, the comprehension, and then going into more of the analysis. But then also really being able to utilize text-dependent questions. and we want to help folks who are on the webinars to be able to develop those for themselves, but really understanding how to utilize those questions that are going to get students to slow down and for a very specific purpose. And then we had a second question in here in our chat, and it's, how do we start this early on? Do we repeat more challenging text in elementary and middle school? I guess my answer to that, and I would encourage Brandon if you would like to add anything, is that one way to start early on is really, the items that Brandon discussed for an AP level course, I think can go all the way back down. This idea of using a touchstone text, but then also being willing to slow down and use these opportunities such as the read aloud, where we are, for our earlier students, really engaging with a text, even though it's done orally, instead of perhaps as we would do as they move through school, on paper, and it's sort of that gradual release. Brandon, would you like to add anything to that, or?
Well, really, I guess I had to promise everybody that we did not plan all of this as nicely as it is all fit together. But you just said gradual release, and like you flipped every button in me, because that's my big thing with teachers is we need that gradual release, and we don't need gradual release until you know that they're ready to be released. Right. I used to have some clever analogy about a bird jumping out of a nest not ready to fly, but I can't think of it right now, but you can figure it out. But that's really what it is. And I saw the question about complex text early on, and I think it's fine to engage elementary, middle school students with more difficult texts, pieces at a time, just like I think it's okay to teach Crime and Punishment to high school students. And I'm never going to say high school students can't. They should be given the opportunity, but a piece at a time. How do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time is the analogy there. And that's how it is with any text. The more complex it gets, the more guidance, the more scaffolding, the more gradual the release needs to be. So if you're teaching fifth graders, and you want to start introducing some more complex texts, and you've just finished reading a short story about segregation maybe, or the civil rights movement, you're not going to have the time, and you're probably not going to want to try to teach all of To Kill a Mockingbird. But what's wrong with bringing in a dialogue from To Kill a Mockingbird, or a chapter even, based on, depending on your students, and slowly, use that anticipation guide and introduce the theme, and then start teaching what do you understand here, what do you struggle with, how can we figure out the parts that you struggle with, to get students more interested in those complex texts, and get out of that mindset of, I don't want to read that, it's too hard, and try to get more towards the mindset of, that's really complex, I think it's got something to tell me, but I got to take my time with it.
Right. Excellent. All right. Thank you so very much, Brandon. We really appreciate your time and all of the information that you shared. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. I enjoy it, and you all are welcome to be in touch with me anytime, and I'll do my best.
Thank you. Take good care.
Yeah,
and we welcome you to stay on the webinar as well. But let's go ahead for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving. So we're going to go back to, and really, again, as I said, Brandon created an excellent bridge for us to go to delve deeper into reader and task. And really that's around, what the instructor or teacher does with the text to help students read and understand it. So as a means to build student self-efficacy, teachers can plan instruction that teaches students how to engage with grade level appropriate complex texts, and to do so on a regular basis. So it doesn't mean that we have to be using these complex texts every single day, all day long, but more it's really in the intention and the purpose for doing it. So we also have to keep in mind that simply assigning complex text to students and expecting that they can or should understand it on their own is not enough. We've discussed taking note of what is complex within it, and then concentrating on working with students on those parts of the text. And then doing so is really going to grow the tools that students will have in their toolbox of skills to comprehend complex texts. So we'll stay on this slide for just another moment. And I wanted to discuss, if we go back to the webinar in November, we really looked at, when evaluating a text for complexity, a teacher should ask themselves 3 things. Where do I want students to go? What's the light bulb moment, which is essentially the purpose for reading this text? There needs to be a purpose. How do I help students find their way there? And where might students struggle? As teachers consider how to help students find their way there, however, they should avoid stealing their students' light bulbs. For example, telling the meaning of the passage, which is often what we want to jump to because it's easy and it's fast. But instead, we want to aim to support students in really discovering those light bulb moments for themselves through thoughtful questions and tasks, which is what we're going to go into. So as we look at the 3 shifts demanded by our standards, we are going to continue to explore complexity, but we're going to weave in shifts 2 and 3 through a focus on close reading. And not only is virtually every standard evident when students close read, the 3 shifts required by the standards are evident as well. So we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So as we think about close analytic reading, close reading really hones in on difficult portions of the text and provides students an opportunity to work with those sections. Close reading opposes the think aloud, where the teacher sometimes explains these difficult portions before students have had the opportunity or chance to learn from them on their own. So instead, when reading an appropriately complex nonfiction or piece of literature, we ask students to respond to text-dependent questions about the text. And so we'll move on to the next one. For our January, I can't believe we're already looking forward to January. For the enrichment task that we would like to invite you to do is to really introduce and to familiarize ourselves with this idea of text-dependent questions, and to do so through a hands-on activity, and then we'll delve deeper into it. College and career ready standards, including the Iowa Core Literacy Standards, expect students to use evidence from the text to present careful analyses, well-defended claims, and clear information. A key method to develop these skills is the use of text-dependent questions. Those are questions that can only be answered by referring back to the text, which is going to slow the student down. They're going to have to be able to go back and find evidence. So for this month's enrichment task, we're going to focus on learning about text-dependent questions that can help unpack features of text complexity. And text-dependent questions can also be used to inspire deeper thinking as students move through the text. And this really creates an opportunity for teachers as well to understand where teachers have confusions or misunderstandings. So the task that we're going to ask that you engage with really goes back to our instructional practice guide coaching tool. And now we had looked at the core action 1, and now we're going to look at core action 2. So I would invite you on your own time, for the sake of time, and we're getting close to the end of this webinar, that you would take the time to click on this link and go back in and look at core action 2A through 2D to really understand when we're using this guide as a reflection tool for as an educator, or if we're using it in a coaching situation. These questions and core actions can really guide you through some of these things to look for and to consider in your planning. The questions that I list here really will help you to reflect on, does the lesson reflect the shifts, and how do I know, but then also how to be really cognizant of planning. So the actual task is located here, And this activity it's going to include evaluating a text and sample set of questions for text dependency using the set of criteria. And so what we would do is we would go in, the directions are to read the questions related to the excerpt from The Great Fire. So we are continuing on with the same text, which is sort of that idea of the touchstone text, where we continue to go back to that same one so that we don't have to understand it. But now we're going to use it to use the criteria that's in the chart that I'll show you momentarily. And you're going to reread each question that's posed here, which are text-dependent questions, and apply the criteria, noting your responses in the chart. So Lee, if you would please click on Core Action 2 Activity. Okay, so you will go through, and it begins, if you scroll down, it begins by offering the questions, and then at the bottom, and there's a blank page in there. But you'll use these to really analyze and go through the set of criteria, and then we will come back together and really talk about your analysis of this activity prior to moving forward. So we would ask that you please complete the activity and be prepared on the next webinar to engage during a conversation regarding this activity and the notes and any questions that may have come up. But this is a great opportunity to dive in and do a hands-on activity, and then we will go further into some tools that you can use to create your own questions, text-dependent questions moving forward.
Updates from the November webinar. During that November webinar, we viewed segments of a coaching conversation with 8th grade English Language Arts teacher Michelle Meisner and the instructional coach Lisa Masuya, utilizing the instructional practice guides. So the segments show that the teacher and coach addressing the task consideration and supports, and those videos are stored on the Iowa Core Advocates YouTube channel. Also, a link to the sample IPG form that they completed is also included in the slide as well, so you can always take a look at that on your own. Then this week, I also added the reflective coaching conversation to the channel, so for those interested in the outcome of the lesson following the planning conversation. In the interest of time, the entire video clip is not going to be shown. However, we would like to show 2 short segments that have been combined and relate specifically to the content. The first segment is a discussion regarding the instructional strategies that the teacher used to help students access the text. And then the next segment will move into the teacher using suggestions in the IPG to decide on best practice for engaging with the lesson. And it is very short, so I think we could take just a minute here to watch this.
So some of the things on that IPG, those questions we worked through, talked about how to help kids access complex text or access. And it sounds like the chunking of it and the reading it out loud. And I mean, what might be some of the other things that you did that made this lesson improve?
I think the vocabulary was also really difficult. So for a lot of those different scenes and scene changes, I found pictures of like a British man of war ship, and I put it up under my doc cam, so that way they could see what it looked like, and then we stopped and we talked about how could that be impressive for somebody to see over the bay, and we took time to really dissect a lot of those higher word vocabulary things. And when I went over to the primary document, we took time that after we read, we did that chunking again, and after we read a section, we reflected on, all right, what happened in the poem? How is this saying? How is this different? And that chunking of the text for both texts really helped them visualize the differences between them.
So now this is the second segment.
What learnings do you take away from this lesson when you look forward?
I think the biggest thing is really sitting back and looking at those questions and thinking about what is the best practice for students to learn, not just the skills that I want them to learn, but how to best get them to that end goal. So I found that the questions that we set when we asked together and we brainstormed together really helped me visualize each different component for my lesson. So that way I could have a very strict lesson in place of first I'm doing this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. Just to keep the flow going and to keep moving from one activity to the next.
Yeah. Okay, we also shared an interview with Christy Dusenberry, and that was regarding why materials matter. So we will end up diving into resources soon to assist with possible steps when curriculum no longer meets the student needs and expectations of the core. And we are going to be wrapping up now. So we have the new research supporting the instructional practice guide, and you can take a look at these independently, but there is a memo that you can read through and then also learn about the research that underpins the IPG. So the actual memo outlines the research behind the core actions and indicators and how those connect to the shifts, and then also how they support content-focused observation. So you could go through and download that independently. Also a reminder to tweet out. So I was really excited when we had one of our members tweet out recently, and so please feel free to continue to share work with us. Then also, this is just review the instructional advocacy forum to continue to give us updates and tell us what you're doing with the sharing of the information and resources. And we'll always ask permission before sharing. And then we do have the feedback form. So again, we've been using your feedback in the way that we're designing these webinars. So if you have a request or question about a specific information or topic, please feel free to go ahead and fill out that form. And then our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, January 9th from 9 to 10 a.m. So Destiny will be sending out a reminder email, and that will be sent a week in advance with the Zoom link. And then Destiny's going to talk about network resources.
Sure. So these are the same resources that we offer every time at the end. Our current website, you can go there, and that's where you're going to be able to find all of the recordings thus far, and also the corresponding materials that go along with each one of those. And then you can also find more literacy resources on iowacore.gov, and then sign up for literacy news you can use, which comes from me once a month with information that's come across my desk. And then the last thing, we always invite you, if you haven't done so already, to sign up to be a national core advocate so that you can receive information from student achievement partners directly. They keep you updated and offer many opportunities to learn and resources to support you as you work in the field. And so that means that we've come to the end of our webinar. We wish for you the happiest of holidays and hope that all of you really do take some time to really disconnect from school and work. And we appreciate you being on today. And if you have any questions or comments, please follow up with that feedback form and take good care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.